The old battle axe will quit within a week. That is what Dr. Caldwell said in the staff lounge at Cedar Creek Medical at 10:13 a.m., standing near the coffee station with his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, his voice carrying across the room with the casual certainty of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered to him. He was laughing when he said it, that particular laugh of someone testing an audience, waiting for others to join in. The surgical residents did. Always did. I'll show her how a real hospital runs, he continued, buttoning his designer jacket with fingers that had never held a retractor outside of pre-rehearsed demonstrations. Push her hard enough and she'll retire. Probably relief for everyone involved. Margaret Walsh did not look up from the medication cart she was restocking. Her steel-grey hair was pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her scalp, and her posture, the kind of posture that comes from 20 years of standing at rigid attention in desert compounds and forward operating bases, remained perfectly, unnaturally straight as she arranged 4 bags in alphabetical order. Her hands did not shake. They never did. The other nurses glanced at her, waiting for some reaction, some sign that she had heard. Margaret's pen moved across the chart in her other hand with mechanical precision, documenting vitals from the night shift with the kind of detail that made junior doctors nervous. She had been at Cedar Creek for 15 years. She was 52 years old, and in that time she had trained 14 nurses who were now charge nurses at 3 different hospitals, had mentored 2 physicians who credited her clinical instincts with catching diagnoses in the first 30 seconds of assessment, and had touched the hand of a man every single night who was dying alone because his family had abandoned him. The hospital administrator had called her steady, reliable, old. Those were not compliments, and Margaret knew this. Dr. Caldwell turned back to his residents, already forgetting her. That was always the mistake people made. They forgot about the quiet ones. They forgot that silence was not the same as absence, that someone could be in a room and somehow invisible if they moved right, spoke softly enough, made themselves small enough to fit into the spaces between the louder people. Margaret continued restocking, her movements economical and deliberate. The tarnished challenge coin in her scrub's pocket felt suddenly heavier, the weight of it pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She did not touch it. Not here. Not where anyone could see. The morning stretched on. Shift change came at noon and Margaret was moving through the cafeteria at 11:56 a.m., a tray in her hands with black coffee and a salad she would not eat, just something to hold, something to carry so her hands would not be empty and useless. The fluorescent lights in the cafeteria hummed with a sound like electricity burning through air, and the smell of institutional food, overcooked vegetables and something vaguely meat-shaped, hung in layers. Dr. Caldwell was there too, making his rounds of the lunch crowd, inserting himself into conversations with the easy arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Margaret was moving past him, her tray steady, when he stepped directly into her path and raised his own arm as if to gesture toward one of his residents. The motion was casual. Unplanned. That was the part that made it worse. He did not even look at her as his elbow caught the edge of her tray and sent it flying, coffee arcing across the tile floor in a brown spray, the salad bowl tumbling end over end, lettuce scattering like green confetti. The crash drew every head in the cafeteria. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the background hum of the kitchen seemed to pause. Dr. Caldwell turned to look at what he had done with the expression of a man genuinely surprised that gravity was real. "Oops," he said, and then he smiled. It was not an apologetic smile. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed something he suspected, that he could do this, that he could knock someone's tray to the floor in front of 40 witnesses and face no consequences. "Clean that up, would you?" he said to no one in particular, already turning away. Margaret's jaw tightened. That was all. Just a microscopic tightening at the hinge, a barely perceptible tension in the muscles that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to read the signs of controlled rage. She set her empty hands down on the nearest counter, steady, fingers flat, palms down, and moved to retrieve her scattered lunch. Other people offered to help. A respiratory therapist bent down to gather letters. One of the younger nurses stood with a paper towel, looking stricken. Margaret accepted their help with a polite nod that conveyed nothing, and within 3 minutes the cafeteria had moved past the incident, conversations restarting, the fluorescent lights buzzing back to their normal frequency of ignored sound. She disposed of the broken bowl in the trash and left, her shoulders still perfectly level, her breathing still even. But that was not the end of it. At 1:33 p.m., during afternoon rounds, Dr. Caldwell passed her in the ICU corridor with a patient chart in his hand. She was charting vitals at a stand-up desk near the nurse's station, her pen moving steadily, her focus absolute. He stopped beside her, and without a word, he dropped the chart on the floor at her feet with enough force that the papers scattered. Then he looked at her with that smile again, the one that was not a smile at all but rather the exposure of teeth that came before something sharp. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the unit, loud enough for the other nurses to hear, loud enough for the residents trailing behind him to process what they were witnessing. Loud enough. Margaret's eyes did not move from the screen in front of her. She did not pause in her charting. Her pen continued its steady movement across the documentation, recording heart rate and oxygen saturation and the precise moment when something fundamental shifted in her assessment of Dr. Caldwell. He was not a challenge. He was a mistake, the kind of small, human mistake that came from never having learned consequence. He was a child swinging a stick in the dark, unaware that he might hit something that swung back. She finished her notation, period, dot, done, set the pen down with the same mechanical precision she had used to pick it up, and rose from the chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of someone who had all the time in the world. She bent down and began to gather the scattered pages, one by one, placing them in order, reconstructing the chart with the kind of care she would have shown a patient's hand. The other nurses watched. The residents watched. Dr. Caldwell stood there with his arms crossed, still smiling that smile, still waiting for something to break. Margaret's hands remained steady. She did not feel trembling. She did not feel rage. She felt the absence of both, the void that came when you had already seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, and this minor cruelty in a hospital corridor, registered as nothing more than background noise. She stood with the reorganized chart and handed it to him. "Doctor," she said, her voice low and level and carrying the kind of authority that made both the residents step back a half step without understanding why. He took the chart, looking slightly wrong-footed, as if something had not proceeded according to plan. Margaret returned to her chair and pulled the screen back into position, her eyes already scanning the vital signs for the patient in room for 12. But that night, alone in the supply closet on the 4th floor where no one ever looked for extra gauze or forgotten equipment, Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving and let herself shake. 30 seconds. That was the rule. 30 seconds of trembling, 30 seconds of the body's response to adrenaline and memory, 30 seconds of the thing she kept locked away from the eyes of colleagues and supervisors and anyone who might have recognized what they were looking at. After 30 seconds, she stopped. She straightened. She touched the challenge coin in her pocket and held it for the span of 5 breaths, and then she went back to work. The night shift was quiet until 2:19 a.m., when the alert came through from the ED. A patient incoming, admitted via ambulance, traumatic brain injury from a military incident overseas. Iraq. Baghdad. The chart came up on the system and Margaret pulled the ICU assignment screen and felt something in her chest shift into a new configuration. The name was Lieutenant Marcus Chen. The rank was Army Ranger. The incident classification was Classified Engagement, Baghdad Province, details pending. Her hands moved on their own, pulling up his full chart, scrolling through the medical history, searching for something she did not want to find but already knew would be there. And then she saw it, the next line in his unit history, the name of the platoon he commanded. Platoon Leader, 2nd Squad, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The same unit. The same number. The same platoon that her son David had been part of 14 years ago, the same squad that had been moving through Fallujah when an IED took out their Humvee, the same command structure that had sent Marcus Chen forward in the chaos to retrieve the body of a 19-year-old Lance Corporal named David Walsh, to carry that body 3 miles through enemy fire to bring him home. Margaret's hand went to the challenge coin. Her fingers closed around it with a pressure that would have left marks on her palm. The code team was being assembled. The helicopter was landing on the pad in 3 minutes. And the man who had carried her son's body through Fallujah was arriving in her ICU, unconscious and broken and unable to speak, just a chart number and a classified incident and a name that had haunted her dreams for more than a decade. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The monitors around the unit beeped in their steady rhythm. The doors of Cedar Creek Medical were about to open, and everything that Margaret Walsh had kept hidden was about to come much, much closer. The monitors hummed their steady electronic chorus as Margaret finished the third round of vitals on the ICU floor, her movements precise as always, her chart notes meticulous and thorough. She had learned long ago that documentation was a weapon, every timestamp accurate, every observation exact, every detail preserved in writing. Caldwell would come looking for ammunition. She would not give him any. At 8 a.m., he arrived in the unit wearing his pressed white coat like armor, flanked by 2 people Margaret recognized immediately, Richard Hayes from the hospital board, whose family had donated the pediatric wing, and someone in administrative business casual she'd seen in the elevator exactly twice. Caldwell's voice carried that particular frequency designed to project authority into every corner of the ICU. "Richard, Jennifer, thank you for coming on such short notice," Caldwell said, shaking hands with both of them. "I wanted to walk you through resource allocation in our acute care setting. We have a patient, admitted last night, traumatic brain injury, non-verbal, minimal recovery prognosis, occupying a level 2 bed at approximately $8,000 per day. The VA has superior long-term care infrastructure for these cases. I've already begun coordination for transfer." Margaret updated the fluid balance on the whiteboard beside the main station, her movements unhurried. Her jaw was a closed fist. Hayes nodded slowly. "How much are we looking at if he stays?" $60,000 weekly, Caldwell said. "Multiply that by his projected stay, he'll be here months before we see any meaningful recovery metrics. The bed generates zero revenue and displaces patients we can actually help. Hospital efficiency depends on these decisions." "What does the neurological assessment protocol say?" Jennifer asked. 72 hours minimum before discharge determination, Caldwell replied smoothly. "But the protocol is designed for patients with recovery potential. This one isn't walking out. He's here to die slowly while we hemorrhage money. I'm suggesting we transition him to the VA this afternoon, free the bed for a post-operative spine patient who's already scheduled for tomorrow." Margaret checked the 4-pump on bed 7, the bag of normal saline dripping steadily, and allowed herself exactly one breath. Chen lay motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest, his eyes tracking nothing, his brain still burning from the shrapnel that had stolen his words. His dog tags lay on the bedside table: Lieutenant Marcus Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment, blood type O positive, faith preference, none. The men and woman moved toward the nursing station. Margaret did not look up from her charting. "The family?" Hayes asked. "No next of kin listed. Enlisted man, never married, parents both deceased. He's got nobody advocating for extended care." "Makes it cleaner," Caldwell said. Margaret's pen pressed against the paper hard enough that the line came out darker than intended. She did not correct it. That darkness would stay. "I can make calls," Caldwell continued. "The VA director owes me a professional courtesy. We could have the transfer paperwork processed by noon, him in an ambulance by 1 o'clock. The bed would be ready for the spine patient by tomorrow morning." Hayes exchanged a glance with Jennifer. "You've already spoken to the VA?" "Not yet. That's pending your approval." "But he's ready." "One call." They discussed numbers, bed availability, transfer protocols, insurance classifications, while Margaret documented Chen's pupils, equal and reactive, although the right side showed slightly delayed response. She documented his grip strength at 2 out of 5 on the right, 0 on the left. She documented that he had not spoken since admission, that his only vocalizations were groans, that the trauma had fractured something deep in the infrastructure of his nervous system. The hospital's antiseptic smell, that particular blend of bleach and industrial soap and something indefinable that lived only in fluorescent-lit corridors, seemed heavier than usual. Margaret noticed she was breathing through her mouth. By 9:15 a.m., Caldwell had the approval. By 9:30, he was making the first phone call. Margaret watched him through the glass partition of the administrative office, watched his mouth move, watched him gesture with his free hand as if the VA director could see him. His voice came through the closed door only as a low murmur, the tone of a man accustomed to being listened to, accustomed to getting what he wanted because wanting it was sufficient. The second call came at 9:50. This time the office door was open. Margaret heard fragments, appreciate the coordination, mutual benefit, 72 hours per protocol, but clinical judgment suggests otherwise, free the bed by end of business today. By 10:15 a.m., it was done. Caldwell emerged from the office and walked directly to the nursing station. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man moving chess pieces on a board where he owned all the pieces. He dropped a transfer order on the counter in front of Margaret, the paper making a soft sound as it landed. "The VA will accept Chen at 1 p.m., he said. "Ambulance is scheduled for 12:30. Get him prepped for transport, stable clothing, medications listed, all records copied. You'll handle the handoff." Margaret looked at the transfer order. Discharge reason, minimal recovery potential, resource allocation optimization. Requested by R.J. Caldwell, M.D., Chief of Surgery. Approved by R. Hayes, Board Member, VA Director. Confirmation pending. "He hasn't completed neurological assessment," Margaret said quietly. "Protocol requires 72 hours minimum." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did I ask for your opinion on protocol?" "No, doctor." "Then I don't want it. The papers are signed. Make the calls." Transport arrives at 12:30. He walked away, his white coat moving with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the system would always bend to accommodate him. Margaret's hand stayed steady on the counter. Her breathing remained even. Her face showed nothing. She did not move for 2 minutes after he left. Then she picked up the transfer order and walked directly to the ICU director's office, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, who had hired Margaret 8 years ago and who still occasionally asked how her son was doing in college before catching herself and offering an awkward sympathy. Margaret knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. Dr. Okonkwo looked up from her computer. "Margaret." "The Chen transfer," Margaret said, placing the order on the desk. "Fast track this morning. Approved by Board Member Hayes. VA Director confirmed. Transport at 12:30. Dr. Okonkwo scanned the paperwork, her expression shifting from curiosity to something harder. This was initiated when Caldwell brought board members in at 8 o'clock. Discussed resource allocation. Made calls at 9:30 and 9:50. Said the VA Director confirmed. 22 hours into admission, Dr. Okonkwo said, more to herself than to Margaret. "That's not protocol." "No," Margaret said. "Did Caldwell pressure the board to approve this?" Margaret chose her words carefully. In the hospital, words were everything. Careful words. Deferential words. Words that never, ever suggested insubordination. He presented resource allocation data. He said the patient has minimal recovery potential. He said the transfer would free the bed. Dr. Okonkwo leaned back in her chair, studying Margaret's face. Something in her expression shifted, a calculation, an assessment, the kind of look that suggested she was adding numbers together and not liking the sum. "Go back to the unit," Dr. Okonkwo said quietly. "Don't process that transfer. I'm going to make some calls." Margaret turned toward the door. "Margaret," Dr. Okonkwo called. "The patient, Chen, does he have family?" "No one listed," Margaret said. But she stopped herself. "But what?" "Nothing. I shouldn't speculate." Dr. Okonkwo stood up. "Speculate. He served in Baghdad. And my son," Margaret's voice went very small, My son served under him. I recognized the name when he came in. The room went completely quiet. Dr. Okonkwo sat back down very slowly. His commanding officer, Margaret, continued, each word precise as a surgical cut. The man who brought my boy home when he died. That's who's in bed 7. Dr. Okonkwo did not speak for a long moment. Then, go back to the unit. Take care of him. I'm going to have a conversation with the administration that will be very uncomfortable for Dr. Caldwell. Margaret nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. At 11:15 a.m., Caldwell received a call in the hallway. Margaret watched him from the nurse's station as his posture shifted, as the confidence drained from his face like fluid from an fall line. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its authority. Yes, sir. I understand. Of course. The protocol should have been followed. I'll notify the VA director myself. The call ended. Caldwell stood in the hallway for almost a minute without moving, his phone still pressed against his ear, before turning and walking toward the ICU office with none of his earlier stride. The transfer was cancelled at 11:45 a.m. Chen stayed in bed 7. The monitors continued their steady beeping. The foredrip continued its measured pacing. And Margaret continued her documentation, her hand steady, her face neutral, fully aware that she had just initiated something that would not end until one of them was gone from Cedar Creek Medical. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, at 2 a.m., when the unit was quietest and the night sky pressed against the hospital windows like a living thing, Chen's heart rate began to climb. The monitors told Margaret everything before her eyes did. At 11 p.m., 3 hours into the night shift, she approached Lieutenant Chen's bedside to check vitals and found his neck veins distended like taut rope beneath papery skin. His blood pressure, which had stabilized at 98/60 just 6 hours earlier, was now dropping in real time, 92/58, then 88/55. The heart rate climbed. 82, 91. 104. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm into the silence of the ICU, steady and oblivious to what was happening inside the chest cavity beneath the surgical tape. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling in the pericardial sac. Pressure building around the heart like a fist slowly closing. She'd seen it before, once in a forward operating base in Helmand Province when a Marine took shrapnel 3 inches from his sternum, once during a rapid helicopter insertion in Fallujah when an IED blast wave alone was enough to rupture capillaries inside the chest. The clinical signs were unmistakable: distended neck veins, dropping blood pressure, climbing heart rate, the body's desperate attempt to compensate for a heart that could no longer fill properly. Pulsus paradoxus would come next, the blood pressure dropping even further with each breath. Then cardiogenic shock. Then nothing. Margaret's hands moved to the monitor, her fingers steady as surgical instruments as she confirmed the rhythm. Sinus tachycardia. No electrical abnormality yet. The damage was mechanical, not electrical. Blood was collecting in the wrong place, and the only way out was a needle and 30 seconds of controlled violence. She paged Dr. Amora, the cardiology resident on call, and her voice remained level, no urgency, no alarm, just information delivered in the flat professional tone that meant nothing to anyone listening but everything to anyone who knew how to hear it. Chen's vitals deteriorating. Distended JVD, BP dropping, heart rate climbing. Possible tamponade. The resident's voice crackled back through the speaker. I'm 15 minutes out from the other building. Get an echocardiogram. Call surgery. 15 minutes. Chen's pressure dropped again, 86/50. Margaret reached for the blood pressure cuff and took another reading herself. Not a machine error. Real numbers. Real deterioration. The code team was 8 minutes away, stationed in the main trauma bay 3 floors below. 8 minutes if they responded immediately. Longer if another code was running. She did the mathematics of survival in her head, blood loss rate at this pace, oxygen saturation dropping grain by grain, the window of reversibility closing like a door in a current-swept channel. For minutes. That's what she calculated. maybe 5 if the patient was young and strong. Chen was both, but strength and youth couldn't fight the physics of pressure and fluid accumulation. The heart needed room to expand to fill. Without it, output fell. Perfusion failed. Death followed, arriving quietly through the back door while everyone was still waiting for it to knock. Margaret moved to the crash cart and pulled open the drawer where emergency supplies lived in their color-coded rows. She drew a 60 cubic centimeter syringe and selected a spinal needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial space, small enough to minimize trauma. Her fingers found the needle with the automaticity of muscle memory embedded 17 years deep, back when she'd been someone else entirely, someone who'd worn a uniform that didn't exist in official records and held a rank that was classified above her pay grade. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Medic, had placed thousands of needles, in veins and arteries, in tension pneumothorax spaces, in bodies breaking under the weight of enemy fire in countries that would never acknowledge her presence there. She positioned Chen's bed flat. The patient's eyes were closed, sedated, unaware that his body was failing in real time. Margaret's palms found the landmarks on his chest, the xiphoid process at the junction where the ribs met, the angle of the left costal margin. She prepped the skin with betadine, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the recycled hospital air. Her left hand palpated the chest wall, feeling for the exact point where needle would meet sac. Not between the ribs, where lung and bone would block her. Below the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees, a trajectory that would enter the pericardial space without touching the myocardium itself. The needle advanced with controlled pressure. Skin. Tissue. The subtle give that meant she'd reached the fibrous layer of the pericardium. A centimeter more. 2. The resistance changed, not dramatic, just different, the way a wall feels different from a door. She advanced the needle just past the pericardial layer and began gentle aspiration with the syringe. The syringe filled with blood. Dark, venous, rich with iron and desperation. 40 cubic centimeters, 60 cubic centimeters, 80 cubic centimeters. Chen's blood pressure rose with each milliliter withdrawn, 88/54 becoming 92/58, then 96/60. The pressure inside the chest cavity dropped as the fluid compressed around the heart was withdrawn, and the heart itself expanded like a released fist, able to fill and contract again. Margaret watched the monitor. The heart rate, which had climbed toward 110, began to fall. 104, 98. 92, sinus rhythm, normal and stable, the electrical activity synchronized with mechanical recovery. She drew 120 cubic centimeters total before the syringe no longer aspirated blood, which meant the needle was no longer in fluid, which meant the pericardial sac was decompressed and the cardiac tamponade was reversed. Margaret withdrew the needle with the same controlled precision she'd used to insert it. The skin bled a single drop. She applied pressure with sterile gauze and didn't allow herself to breathe normally until the bleeding stopped and the gauze came away clean. The monitor displayed a patient transformed. Blood pressure 98/66. Heart rate 84. Oxygen saturation 97%. Sinus rhythm clear and strong. Margaret disposed of the needle into the sharps container and was documenting the procedure when the code team arrived, running, cardiac monitor cart leading them like a battering ram through the doorway. Status report, the senior resident called, but Margaret was already stepping back from the bedside to give them space. Patient presented with distended neck veins, declining blood pressure, tachycardia. Clinical presentation consistent with cardiac tamponade. Procedure performed at 0200 hours. 120 milliliters of sanguineous fluid aspirated from pericardial space. Vitals have normalized. The resident stared. The nurses with the cart stared. The rhythm on the monitor told them everything they needed to know. This patient wasn't in arrest, wasn't in crisis, was stable in ways that contradicted the emergency call that had brought them running. Who performed the procedure? The resident asked. I did, Margaret said. The resident's mouth opened. Closed. He was young, maybe 28, still believing that procedure hierarchy meant something absolute. That's outside the scope of He was in cardiogenic shock. The code team was 8 minutes out. His window was closing. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a justification. It was a statement of fact delivered in a voice that had ordered men to move under fire, that had stayed calm while blood pooled in body cavities, that understood better than anyone in that room that some rules were made by people who'd never faced a choice between protocol and death. Margaret stepped away from Chen's bedside and returned to the nursing station to finish her documentation. She should have seen Dr. Caldwell coming. She would have, 3 years ago, before Cedar Creek, when her senses had been sharp as broken glass and her eyes saw movement 2 rooms away. But the night shift had made her soft in small ways. She'd been a nurse for 15 years, and that identity had begun to calcify into genuine. So when Caldwell appeared in the ICU doorway at 2:17 a.m., still in his tuxedo from a board dinner, his bow tie already loosened into a silk noose around his neck, she simply turned from her documentation. His face was the color of spoiled meat. His voice came out like a blade across glass. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Walsh?" Margaret set down her pen. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with the expression of someone who'd already calculated that this moment was inevitable and unimportant. Saving a patient. You performed a pericardiocentesis. You. A nurse. Do you have any concept of scope of practice? Do you understand the liability you've just created? His voice had risen enough that 3 heads turned from other bedside monitors. Caldwell didn't care. He was standing in the center of the ICU now, pointing at Margaret with a hand that trembled with a kind of rage she recognized from other men in other moments, the rage of someone discovering that the order they believed in wasn't absolute. The patient was in cardiogenic shock, Margaret said quietly. Code team was 8 minutes out. That's not your decision to make. He turned and stared at Chen, at the monitor displaying normal vitals, at the syringe of blood still in the sharps container. His eyes went to the security camera mounted in the corner of the ICU, the one that recorded every procedure, every movement, every violation of hospital protocol. He smiled. It wasn't a smile that made the room warmer. He left the ICU at 2:41 a.m., moving with the purpose of a man who'd just been given a gift. Margaret watched him go with the knowledge that everything had changed, that the moment she'd chosen to act instead of wait, she'd also chosen to step out of the careful shadow she'd maintained for 15 years. She'd saved Lieutenant Marcus Chen's life. She'd also, with precision equal to the needle she'd guided into his pericardial sac, ended her career at Cedar Creek Medical. The code team was doing rounds anyway now, checking Chen's dressing, verifying his rhythm, running an EKG that would show nothing abnormal. The senior resident approached Margaret at the station. That was... He paused. That was textbook pericardiocentesis. Who trained you? Margaret didn't answer. She'd already learned not to answer certain questions, not to speak about the years before Cedar Creek, not to let anyone know that the quiet nurse with the steel-grey hair and the military straight spine had ever been anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. She simply returned to her charting and let the question hang in the air like breath on cold glass. The security footage didn't lie. It never did. A grainy black and white timestamp reading 2:14 a.m. showed Margaret's hands moving with surgical precision, the spinal needle sliding between Chen's ribs, the arterial cannula positioned exactly where it needed to be. The tape showed her administering emergency pericardiocentesis without a physician present, without authorization, without the protocols that governed every single invasive procedure in the hospital. Dr. Caldwell watched the footage on repeat in the administrator's office, his jaw tightening with something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had his ammunition now. Real, recorded, undeniable ammunition. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. Margaret sat in a leather chair across from Hospital Administrator Patricia Hughes, her back straight despite the fluorescent lights that hummed like trapped wasps overhead. To her left sat the Chief Nursing Officer, Dorothy Kim, whose expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. To her right were 2 board members Margaret had never seen before, an older man in a charcoal suit and a woman whose wedding ring caught the light as she turned pages of a thick file. And at the back of the room, Dr. Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, his face arranged in an expression of reluctant concern, as though he were witnessing a tragedy rather than orchestrating one. The footage played on the monitor. Margaret watched her own hands on that screen, watched herself save a man's life while violating the foundational architecture of hospital protocol. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular sterility of air conditioning that never quite cycled fresh oxygen. "You performed a pericardiocentesis," Administrator Hughes said. Her voice carried regret, which somehow made it worse than anger. "A procedure well outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse. An invasive procedure that requires physician authorization and presence." Margaret said nothing. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her breathing steady. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. "You endangered the patient," Dr. Caldwell said from the back of the room. "Regardless of the outcome." "He would have died in 6 minutes," Margaret said quietly. Her voice carried no defense, no emotion, just fact. "The code team was 8 minutes out. I drew 120 cc of blood from his pericardial sac. Sinus rhythm returned at the 60-second mark." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Caldwell stepped forward. "You don't have the authority to make that decision. The protocols exist for a reason. They exist to prevent lawsuits," Margaret said. Still calm. Still level. "Not to prevent death." Board Member 1, the woman, he exchanged a look with Dorothy Kim. Administrator Hughes pressed her palms flat on the desk. "Margaret, you saved his life. Everyone in this room understands that. But you also violated every protocol we have in place. We have regulatory bodies, licensing requirements, liability frameworks. We cannot ignore this." Hughes's voice wavered slightly. "We have to let you go. Effective immediately." Margaret nodded. No trembling. No crack in her voice. Just the faint acknowledgement of a woman who had already survived worse than losing a job. She'd survived Baghdad. She'd survived the extraction in Kabul. She'd survived watching her son's name appear on a casualty list from a command she couldn't discuss. This was manageable. This was almost nothing. She stood without being dismissed. "You'll need to surrender your badge and access credentials," Dorothy Kim said, avoiding eye contact. "We'll have security escort you to your locker." Margaret walked toward the door. Dr. Caldwell stepped slightly aside, his expression a mixture of triumph and something uglier, something that looked almost like hunger. He hadn't just wanted her fired. He'd wanted her destroyed. But the firing was only the beginning of what he'd set in motion. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Caldwell activated networks that most nurses didn't even know existed. He called 3 members of the state medical licensing board, his voice smooth and concerned, planting seeds like toxins into soil. "I'm just worried about her competency. Some documentation irregularities that have me concerned. You might want to look into her record." He personally contacted the chief nursing officers at 5 hospitals where Margaret had worked over 15 years, Memorial General in Jersey City, Walter Reed in Washington, Mount Sinai in New York, Cleveland Clinic, and Mercy General in Boston. In each conversation, he mentioned concerning patterns, questionable clinical judgment, potential safety issues. Not accusations. Just concerns. Just enough to make people nervous. Then he brought in an outside healthcare consultant, a man named Vincent Mercer from a firm called Clinical Integrity Partners. Mercer was given unrestricted access to every patient chart Margaret had touched in 5 years. That was approximately 8,400 charts. He began auditing them systematically, looking for documentation gaps, procedure timing inconsistencies, any deviation from standard charting protocols. Mercer's job wasn't to find wrongdoing, it was to interpret normal nursing documentation through the lens of predetermined guilt. A handwritten note at 2:34 a.m. became documentation irregularities during night shift. A blood pressure recorded 5 minutes before a physician's order became procedural sequencing questions. The consultant built his case like a mason laying bricks, methodically, relentlessly, piece by piece. Dr. Caldwell's goal was complete erasure. Not just firing. Not just career damage. Complete professional annihilation. He wanted to ensure that no hospital system in the Mid-Atlantic would ever hire Margaret Walsh again. He wanted her credentials questioned, her judgment forever suspect, her entire career retroactively contaminated by association with his constructed narrative of systemic negligence. And Margaret couldn't fight back. Because fighting back would mean explaining where she learned to perform emergency pericardiocentesis with a spinal needle. It would mean discussing the 14 combat medical courses she'd completed, the 247 emergency procedures she'd performed in field conditions on 4 continents, the way her hands had learned to work faster than her mind during situations where hesitation meant death. It would mean surfacing the classified medical training provided by Naval Special Warfare Command, the black site protocols she'd executed in places that didn't officially exist. It would mean breaking the single most important condition of her new life. She would have to reveal that she was Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Navy, Medical Special Operations Technician, and she had signed paperwork swearing she would remain invisible, anonymous, erased as the price of a senator's son's life extracted from a black site in Kabul in 2019. The government had already buried her once. If she surfaced now, she'd be burying herself. 3 days after her termination, Margaret sat in a booth at the Midnight Diner on Frankford Avenue in Philadelphia. The coffee was lukewarm and had been for the past hour. Rain hammered the windows in sheets, each drop striking the glass like applause for a tragedy. The clock above the counter read 3:14 a.m. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled tight, shoulders still held military straight despite 16 hours without sleep, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold. The glass showed her face like a ghost, translucent and barely there, the kind of apparition that existed only because it hadn't finished disappearing yet. The government had already buried her once. And now she was sitting in an all-night diner watching herself fade away all over again, knowing that this time there was nobody coming to pull her from the wreckage. This time the extraction would be permanent. She'd saved the life of a man who had carried her dead son's body 3 miles through enemy fire, and in return, she'd lost everything she'd carefully constructed over 15 years of quiet nursing. The math was impossible. The sacrifice was uneven. And there was nothing she could do about it except watch her coffee go cold and remember what it felt like to be alive. The rain had stopped by morning, but Margaret could still smell it on the pavement outside Cedar Creek Medical, that sharp metallic tang that comes after a storm passes through a city and leaves everything raw. She was sitting in her kitchen at 7:30 a.m., staring at nothing, when her phone rang. It was David Jr. His voice was different. Harder. Like something had shifted inside him overnight. "Mom, I'm going to the hospital. Don't try to stop me." She didn't ask why. She already knew. A mother recognizes the tone of someone who has made a decision that will either destroy or save everything. David Jr. walked into the administrator's office 43 minutes later, his backpack heavy with the weight of things that were supposed to stay buried. The board meeting was in session, 12 people sitting around a mahogany table, reviewing the consultant's preliminary findings on Margaret's alleged negligence, preparing to recommend her permanent exclusion from the medical licensing registry. Dr. Caldwell sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, his fingers steepled like a man who had already won. David Jr. didn't knock. He opened the door and upended the backpack onto the conference table. Metal spilled across the mahogany-like coins from a shattered vault. 2 bronze stars. A silver star. 2 purple hearts. And at the center, a tarnished military challenge coin, dull with age and the fingerprints of 1,000 soldiers who had held it and understood what it meant. "Mom, they need to see these," David Jr. shouted, his voice carrying down the corridor with the force of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The volume wasn't anger. It was clarity. They need to know who they're firing. The board members froze. Down the hall, the lobby emptied as nurses, orderlies, and visitors turned toward the sound. Feet began moving. Within 30 seconds, the corridor outside the administrator's office was filled with people, their bodies pressed against the doorframe, their eyes locked on the medals scattered across the table. Lieutenant Chen was wheeled into the hallway by an orderly who had no idea what was about to happen. His tablet was in his hands. His jaw was still locked from the neurological damage, his voice still silent, but his fingers moved with the precision of someone who had trained for combat. He scrawled across the screen in letters large enough for everyone to read. Codename Nightingale, she pulled me out of Fallujah in '04 when I was a sergeant. The tablet screen was held up, and the words passed from hand to hand like a prayer. Codename Nightingale. The name carried weight in the silence. It meant something. It meant everything. Nobody in that corridor knew what it meant, but they felt its gravity anyway, the way a room feels different when a veteran salutes, when the air itself seems to recognize honor. The elderly security guard, Raymond Holloway, had been working Cedar Creek's front desk for 21 years. Vietnam vet. Bronze Star. 2 tours in the Mekong Delta. He was standing at the back of the crowd when he read the name on Chen's tablet, and something shifted in his posture, a rigidity, a recognition, a salute that rose from his spine like muscle memory answering to a voice that hadn't spoken in decades. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh, sir," he said, his voice cutting through the corridor with the force of a command. The words carried 3 floors up through the ventilation system. Feet stopped on the 2nd floor. A conversation died mid-sentence on the 3rd. The hospital held its breath. The administrator's phone rang at 8:33 a.m. The voice on the other end was clipped, military, precise. 2-star General Harold Mitchell, Assistant Deputy Director of Naval Special Warfare, calling from the Pentagon. He was arriving at Cedar Creek Medical in 43 minutes, and he would need a conference room, full security clearance, and the immediate presence of all board members and hospital leadership. He arrived at exactly 9:31 a.m. The uniform arrived first, dress blues, medal spanning his chest like a story written in ribbons and metal. His bearing moved through the hospital corridors like a shock wave, causing orderlies to straighten and visitors to instinctively lower their voices. Behind him walked 2 men in dark suits with the kind of posture that suggested they had spent their careers carrying secrets. General Mitchell sat at the head of the conference table, the same table where Dr. Caldwell had sat, relaxed and victorious, 30 minutes earlier. The general opened a classified file folder marked Operation Phoenix Team with a red security clearance stamp on every page. His voice was steady, factual, stripped of emotion. Margaret Walsh served as a medical specialist, later promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command, for 23 years and 4 months. Her service record includes 2 Bronze Stars for valor under fire, 1 Silver Star for extraordinary heroism, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross for actions that saved the lives of her entire combat unit. He paused. He let the words settle. Margaret Walsh has saved 247 lives across 4 continents. She has trained over 184 combat medics. She has conducted surgical procedures in forward operating bases with nothing but moonlight, a surgical kit, and hands steady enough to thread a needle while artillery impacted 300 meters away. Dr. Caldwell's face had gone pale. His fingers were no longer steepled. They were trembling. General Mitchell continued. During Operation Enduring Freedom in Fallujah, 2004, Master Chief Walsh took a 7.62mm round meant for her entire squad. She completed her patrol after being shot. She treated 3 service members with blast injuries. She walked back to base carrying 40 pounds of equipment and a round lodged in her shoulder. She refused evacuation for 6 hours until she had trained a junior medic to take over her duties. That medic is now sitting in this hospital. He gestured toward the hallway where Chen was waiting. We have her on record saving his life. Twice. The room was soundless. Not the absence of noise. Actual silence. The kind of silence that exists when people are realizing they have made a mistake so profound that it cannot be unmade with an apology. Lieutenant Chen was brought into the conference room. His tablet was ready. His fingers moved, and the message appeared on the screen with the finality of a judge's gavel. She took a bullet meant for my entire squad and they buried the mission. I've spent 15 years looking for the medic who disappeared. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Then 30. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The administrator's mouth had opened slightly, as if words existed somewhere inside him but had forgotten how to form. What happened next didn't take long. The hospital's investigation pivoted immediately from Margaret to Dr. Caldwell. The outside consultant Caldwell had hired, a man named Vincent Harris, who worked for 3 hospitals across the region, began reviewing the data he'd assembled. He was looking for negligence in Margaret's charts, but what he found instead was systematic fraud in Caldwell's own surgical outcome reports. Mortality rates had been adjusted. Complication rates omitted. Patient outcomes fabricated to maintain his reputation and secure bonuses tied to performance metrics. 78 falsified records. 3 years of data manipulation. $200,000 in fraudulent bonuses. By the afternoon of day 3, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was involved. Agents in dark suits with federal credentials sat in the administrator's office and began the process of building a case. By Thursday, the hospital's board voted unanimously to terminate Dr. Caldwell for cause and cooperate fully with federal investigators. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His privileges at Cedar Creek were revoked. His contracts voided. The arrest happened at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents arrived at his colonial-style house in Bryn Mawr, the one with the 3-car garage and the landscaping service that cost $1,200 a month, and placed him under arrest for healthcare fraud, falsifying medical records, and obstruction of justice. They led him out in handcuffs, his hands behind his back, his face exposed to the early morning light and the ring cameras of his neighbors. The perp walk footage made the evening news in every market on the eastern seaboard. Prominent surgeon arrested for fraud. Cedar Creek Medical corruption scandal widens. The headlines multiplied like a virus. By the next morning, Caldwell had become the face of institutional corruption. His mugshot was everywhere. His salary was public record. $500,000 annually to forge records and destroy lives. Margaret watched the broadcast from her living room with David Jr. sitting beside her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The universe had corrected itself. Not through her hands. Through the simple, inevitable consequences of arrogance meeting truth. The hospital's offer came by courier the next day. Reinstatement. Back pay. Promotion to nurse manager. A formal apology from the board. Margaret read it twice and set it down on the kitchen counter. She had a counteroffer. Instead of returning to Cedar Creek as staff, Margaret Walsh designed and implemented the Combat Medic to Civilian Healthcare Transition Program, a comprehensive pathway for military medical personnel to enter civilian medical practice without losing their specialized expertise. She worked directly with the Veterans Administration. She consulted with 3 major medical centers in the Northeast. She built the system that would eventually train thousands of combat medics to become civilian nurses, paramedics, and surgical technicians. The hospital didn't just rehire her. They made her chief of emergency medicine. 3 stars on her credentials. The Navy Trident pin on her white coat. 2 years later, on a cold Tuesday morning in February, Margaret Walsh drove 40 minutes outside Philadelphia to Monroe Community College. The rain had started again, that same metallic smell, that same sharp edge to the air. She parked her car and walked down into the basement of Building C. Dr. Caldwell was teaching CPR fundamentals to a class of 12 community college students. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a resuscitation mannequin, his movements mechanical, his voice the practiced patter of someone teaching a script to people who would forget it as soon as they left the classroom. $18 an hour. No benefits. No prestige. No board members deferring to his expertise. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. His hand stopped moving. The color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. He knew. Some part of him had always known this moment would come. The universe doesn't forget. It only waits. Margaret Walsh walked to his desk. She didn't speak. She placed the tarnished SEAL Team 3 challenge coin on top of his grade book, the coin that had traveled through 4 wars, that had been touched by hands that understood sacrifice, that David Jr. had carried in a backpack to save her life. She let him see the 3 stars on her hospital credentials. She let him see the Navy Trident pin on her white coat. She held his gaze for 5 seconds, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the kind of absolute clarity that comes from having already survived the worst this world has to offer. Then she turned and walked out. In the hallway, she paused beside a poster about excellence in healthcare, and she spoke in a voice just loud enough for him to hear through the open door behind her. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She drove back to Cedar Creek. Lieutenant Chen was waiting in her office, not in a wheelchair anymore, but walking now, his sentences shorter but solid, his voice returning in pieces like a tide coming back in. He saluted as she passed his desk. She nodded, and they both kept moving, because some moments of honor don't require words. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength of hidden heroes. Like this video if you believe the best warriors don't always wear uniforms. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?